Thank you everyone for joining us today, first of all. My name is Andre Karlstrom and I'll be your host for this session. Today, as you all know, we're presenting a technical webinar on enhancing the Spring Security Framework with attribute-based access control. Our speakers for today is Sridhar Nair, and Sridhar brings great knowledge to the Axiomatics team, including an understanding of security issues related to virtualization and the cloud-based delivery model. Joining him is Mr. Finn Frisch, and he's VP of Business Development here at Axiomatics. Finn brings a wealth of experience ranging from enterprise security, privacy, identity, and access management and product development. So you'll be in excellent hands today, and I'll go and turn it over to you guys. Take it away.
Thank you, Andre. Hi, Finn.
Hey, Sridhar. Nice to meet you again in this virtual office.
Indeed. For those who have missed it, we had a similar kind of webinar yesterday, mostly geared towards the US side of the time zone. So Finn and I was talking about similar kind of questions and coverage on that webinar as well. Indeed, yeah. So let's just get started. And this is kind of the agenda that we would like to cover today in the webinar. We're going to start quickly with an introduction on Spring, specifically the Spring Security Framework, and how it has over the age improved itself in the authorization and access control field and made it easy to do a lot of decoupling between the security logic and the application logic or the business logic at a lot of times, and how it's kind of positioned in the right place and the right point in time to go beyond the typical built-in access control mechanisms it has. And then we will link that to what we have been talking about regularly about the attribute-based access control and how externalizing the authorization concept, the process, would make it easier for us to do a management better, auditing capabilities better in a policy-based framework. And that we will tie it how Spring can then be extended to make use of that externalized access control and authorization capabilities, and how we within Axiomatics have been doing that with using our Spring Security SDK that's available for our customers to work with. And if you're interested, of course, you're more than welcome to talk to us about it. And last but not the least, as Andre mentioned, we will be looking at the questions you have. So please feel free to write down your questions at the question box in the GoToMeeting window. So before we quickly go through the intricate technical details, we just want to give a quick idea of what we mean when we talk about authorization. It's a very simple definition that we have, but it's scoped in such a way that it excludes a whole lot of other things, because authorization is a heavy word. It's loaded with a lot of meanings. And for us, when we talk about authorization, it's mostly related to computer systems, access control with softwares, talking to applications and softwares behaving on behalf of other users and so on. But the authorization itself is, in a way, a permission to execute an action on a given information asset and under certain conditions. So if you are allowed to do something based on certain criteria that's been assigned either to the resource or to the person who is trying to do something, that's authorization basically. And authorization almost always utilizes authentication, even though there is always a kind of a confusion between the demarcation between where authentication ends and where authorization begins. And a lot of times, why are there two different parts, and why can't we just have one single thing? Finn, we typically see that a lot with our customers, where there is almost always a starting confusion between authentication and authorization. Would you agree with that?
Yes, indeed. But whereby, though, I would assume that for people who have a special interest in Spring Security and are familiar with Spring Security, they are also familiar with the fact that these need to be logically separated, because that's one of the advantages with Spring, that they have done a clear sort of separation between the two. Conceptually, you have a lot of these things already ready within the Spring Security Framework, right?
Yep, Indeed, and that's actually a good point, Finn, because if you look at Spring Security, and let's take a quick a step back and find out how the history of Spring Security and how it evolved, and then we will give a quick intro if you haven't been familiarizing yourself with Spring Security. The first class citizen kind of um, bestowed up approach that Spring has given to authentication and access control. So Spring Security came up because in order to fill a crucial gap that existed within the Java libraries and the Java frameworks to handle specifically authentication and authorization. It's, as we would expect, a comprehensive framework to do just that, authentication and authorization. A whole lot of tangles have been made easier, and it fills the gap because the Java Authentication and Authorization Service and Java EE Security provides some of these capabilities, but it has always had um, some limitations, as some would call it. For example, some of them are app-centric, some of them have a very complex and hard to extend kind of design. And Spring Security tries to bring all this together in a single framework and a distribution which is app server independent rather, adaptable and versatile because it allows you to extend it. And we use that extensibility option of Spring Security a lot in our work that we are kind of explaining here. And of course, if you're interested in servlet APIs, if you're interested in JSF, and if you're interested in Spring MVC or Spring Data, there's all integration capabilities to that. And we are in version 4 of the Spring Security Framework, which means it has gone its round, it has done its rounds, become mature. And from what I can understand from our customers and general kind of poll, it has got a big market in the enterprise Java application development space. So if you look at the history, as we said, J2EE security was difficult to use, inflexible, and app-centric. So somewhere around 2003, we saw the birth of what was then called ACG security in 2003. It became Apache license in 2004. With the main idea of providing some basic security services for the existing Spring framework. As luck would have it, it became very popular because of all the things we just mentioned, and it got incorporated into Spring as what we call the Spring Security Framework right now. The 1.0 release of Spring Security Framework was in 2006, and 4.0 was in March of this year. So it's gone through its kind of maturity cycles, and it's if I can say that, it's pretty mature, and it's got a lot of integration point and a lot of great capabilities that makes it ideal for use within authorization access control requirement space for enterprise applications. One of the things that we keep talking about in this webinar is the fact that security should be treated as a cross-cutting concern, and Spring does that. Spring makes it easier because it does that decoupling effect. It decouples the security logic from the app logic up to a point, and that up to a point, I guess, is the place where we come in and say, look, there is something extra we can do. And as we have mentioned, its position, and I'll explain why in the slides further down, it's in a great place to be extended and used to do the externalized and fine-grained policy-based access control. It fits right there because it's already got the nuts and bolts in place. So, and most of the time, the practitioners of the framework already have started thinking about access control. So moving towards an attribute-based access control or policy-driven access control is one small step from where they are right now. Would you agree, Finn, about the points that we have mentioned in this slide?
Yes, indeed, and I think it's important to point out as well that the ACG security framework brought something new to the market as well, namely an acronym that means nothing, as far as I know, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the cooler parts for this, yeah.
True, yeah. So as I just mentioned earlier, authentication and authorization is kind of the central key pieces in Spring Security, and you can right away see that because it's got a pretty big important step position within the framework. For example, you have what's called the authentication object or user detail objects that contains details about the authentication aspect of the user or the user details aspect of the user or the principal. That's the nomenclature they use in that framework, and it becomes app specific extensible as well. So if you have a data model about a user and you have email address of that person, the location of that person, all in the data model, you can extend the user detail object to hold all this information as well. And as you can see, that snippet of code there, it's actually relatively easy compared to a whole lot of hoops you would have had to jump through otherwise to get details about the user that's logged into that framework and using the app written in that framework. For example, if you want to get the username, you basically find out the principal and then get username, and the function exists already out of the box for you to get the details out there. And also the granted authority objects that's available holds the authority of the permission that's granted to the principal once he has logged in, or maybe even before he has logged in. And these authorities are typically from the slightly oldish role-based access control. So you have basically administrator roles, role user, and so on. But those exist, and that's readily available.
Right. But Srigit, isn't it true as well that it's fairly easy within Spring to use then the various providers to, for instance, get this information from external sources to connect to your LDAP, to database or
Oh, yes.
other, right? So the information that we can get about the user, the subject attributes from our perspective that we'll talk about later, it's fairly easy to gather them from a great many resources, right?
Indeed, yes, definitely. And if you look at the architecture itself in Spring Security and Spring in general, it's pretty modular and it's extensible. So you can hook up your own connectors if you want, or as we would show later on, you can even leave that to the evaluation engine side of things as well, if that's not something you wanted above and beyond the authorization space. But as you rightly point out, Finn, Spring and Spring Security, it makes things easy to kind of expand your scope or your capability required. So for example, if you look at the access decision manager concept that existed in Spring from very early on, that's the core part of the logic which decides the access control that's given to a user. So for example, it implements different voters, for example, something called the role voter, the authenticator voter, and so on. And each of these voters are polled by the access decision manager for a result. So you could basically write your own voters that implements the logic that you have, and then give decisions on what's allowed or what's not allowed. So you could basically then use the authentication, the principle, the object that we discussed before, the secure objects that you're going to try and secure, and the metadata attributes that Finn you just mentioned, for example, things you get from the LDAP directory, and give all that to the voter, and then the voter basically decides and says yes or no, and then the access decision manager collates all that information and decides at the end of the day what can be allowed to happen for a specific user. But of course, this has been fair in Spring Security for a while, and while it is nice and while it's powerful, it still doesn't make it that easy for developers, especially the end developers of the application, to work with. So in about Spring 3.0, which I think was released in 2009, Spring Security came up with the concept of expression-based access control, and that makes it so much more easier for people to do authorizations within the code or the interface definitions of classes. So it makes it easier and extensible as well. So we have expressions, and we'll talk about these different kind of expressions that's available for doing access control at the web level, so URL level, UI, JSP level, and method security level. So if you have an application which definitely has multiple tiers, you can use all these hooks to decide or do access control in different parts of your application. And it comes out of the box with a lot of built-in expressions. For example, you could use expression called has role and then give a role admin. So you could basically say do this only if has role admin, or you could say something like has IP address, an IP address range, and so on. So Spring expression language is perfectly poised to make it easier for people to write their own access control rules within the application logic, yet still make it separated out so you don't have if then else conditions within your logic of your application code to allow certain actions to happen or not happen. So let's take a look at a couple of these examples to kind of know what they're talking about, and this makes it easier for us to explain further down the line how you would hook it onto ABAC and externalized authorization. So the web security expression, so what you're seeing in the code here is the fact that you are putting an access control which says if somebody is trying to access the /admin side of the web app, it needs to have the role admin and has to come from an IP address, the internal IP address range, basically. So only if these two conditions are met, and they are basically access control conditions, will you allow the access to proceed. Otherwise, you basically get back an access denied exception. And this is something that you can do out of the box using Spring Security 3 and onwards. So the idea is basically to use the intercept URL element here and use the use expression as true. And the way they implement it internally for those who are interested would be to create a new voter called the web expression voter that's added to the access decision manager. So it's one more voter added to the other voters that we saw before, and that says yes or no based on your access control rules. Now that's one level of access control that we have, but more interesting, I would say, is the method security expression, where you can decide how or when somebody is allowed to call a method and the conditions under which that should be allowed. So Spring Security has the concept of pre-post invocation authorization checks. So you could do pre-authorize or post-authorize. The idea is this: if you are annotating pre-authorize on top of a method call, you're basically saying that before you make that method call, you need to check the conditions that's applicable, and only if that's applicable will you allow the call to happen. The post-authorized is less often used, and in some cases it's useful, would be to let the call go through, let the execution happen, and then check for certain conditions. And if it doesn't get met, you still throw an access exception. So for example, one of the things we have here is the pre-authorize has role user. So you basically, what this says is if before you can call the create method, you need to be a user within the system. If you are not, so if you are not authenticated and somehow get to the point where you can call that method, you will get an access decision error on an exception. And in the case here for a post authorize, what you're saying is that get event, so you basically call the get event, you get an event object, and then only if you are an owner, so basically the owner of this object is you, or you are an administrator, will you be allowed to proceed further. So you get the event, check whether the administrator is either you are an administrator, in which case you can access all events, or you get the details about the event only if you, the principal.id, is the owner of that event. So there are cases where you can use post-authorize, and there are cases where you can use pre-authorize. And to use that, it's as simple as annotating the method with pre-authorize, post-authorize, and then providing the conditions. And that's all there in Spring Security. Now you also have the concept of filtering. So you could basically say that, look, I want to call some things, I get a list or a set, and then I want to delete elements in that based on some condition. So you could basically do things like that as well by saying get events. So you get a list of events, and then you filter out by saying that remove all the events, list of events in here if certain conditions are not met. So if you're not the owner or if you're not the attendee, you remove from that list. So you basically get all events and then remove certain events. That's the post filter. Or you could do a pre-filter by saying you can save a whole lot of set of events only if you're the owner of that event. So Spring basically allows you to do a whole lot of these things on the go itself without doing any extensions, and all that it needed right now is basically using annotations in front of methods. And now to come up with the UI part of it, so we have covered the URL, the method, and now let's take a look at the UI. What Spring Security allows you to do is use what's called the tag libraries, and one in particular, the Authorize tag, which basically allows you to provide conditions again. So in this example, what you're basically saying is that only if you're authenticated, and that's one of the status you can populate yourself, it's like a value you can populate, will you be able to see the link that's specifically mentioned here. So my events. So if you are not logged in, you don't see my events link, but the moment you get logged in, this part, this block, it's true, and then you get to see the link. So that's what it is now from Spring Security point of view. And as you can see, Spring has got a lot of things in place. And what though is still lacking is the fact that you write your conditions, all the things that you want checked. For example, in the previous slide, things like this principal ID is equal to attendee ID or principal ID is equal to owner.id. Those kind of conditions you check and you specify as a part of the code still. It's decoupled, but it's still part of the application code or the class code that you would write. And that's where we think we can do the next jump in the maturity of the framework and make it easier for users and developers to decouple the access control completely from the application logic. Now, why? Why would you want to do that? And what are the great things about access control from an attribute-based point of view or externalized authorization point of view? Let's take a couple of slides to explain that. As we have said before, security is a cross-cutting concern, and Spring is a big step in the separating the security from the app logic, and authorization access control is built in, just what we mentioned before. And in a way, it is actually externalized using authorization, kind of what I mentioned in the last couple of slides, because a lot of times if you look at applications, you actually see applications doing if then else statements to allow certain methods to be called or not called. At least Spring doesn't do that. It actually allows you to annotate and then ask access control decisions there, not coupling it to the level that it's impossible to separate out. But wouldn't it be a lot more cooler if in conjunction with Spring Security, you could call out to an externalized authorization service. So you have a central place where you manage your policies and your rules of access control, and then you can call out to that and get the decisions. Use policy-based fine-grained access control rules for authorization, because at this day and age where things are getting more and more complex when it comes to regulatory compliance issues, you want the full power of policy writing capabilities, and it just doesn't cut if you have simple attendee equals owner kind of, or principal ID is equal to owner kind of requirements. That cuts for most of the time, but there are a lot of more complex rules. And of course, wouldn't it be great if you could use rich attributes available both in the evaluation context and from the external outside world? For example, if you have attributes about the user from somewhere in your LDAP directory or your geo IP address table, that'll be great if you can hook into that and use that. Now, why would you want to do that? This is one of the codes that we often use, but it's actually a very interesting code because in 2014, Gartner predicted that for about 5% of enterprises which use attribute-based access control for their access control mechanisms, it's going to grow to 70% of enterprises using it by 2020. And Finn, if I'm not mistaken, we actually have an updated prediction from Gartner, which is more aggressive in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. This was repeated in 2015, not too long ago, and then states that by 2018, 35% of enterprises will have reached this goal. So they predict that the first half will be done now in not too many years, 3 years, right?
Yeah, 3 years. So 3 years, and you see a big jump from 5 to 35,
Yeah.
30.
And I mean and it's up from less than 55% today, it says. But at the same time, if we look into where we have this sort of, the move has started a lot earlier, I would say, and to a certain extent, what you just talked about on the previous slide, Sridhar, where I would say Spring has been sort of part of this movement, because it created from early on this very clean logical separation between the
Yep.
business concerns of your application code and the security concerns of your application, right? So they externalize from early on the security needs into something that remained internal. So they internalized, you could say. But this separation is sort of a very clear, first step. And I would assume that some of the 5% may very well be sort of Spring-based applications. Right?
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. And well, the couple of drivers that we see for the recent move towards ABAC is the fact that a lot of times applications deal with what we call the role-based access control mode, where you have users assigned to roles given permissions, and permissions are able to do things. And there are limitations associated with that. We have a couple of white papers and a couple of webinars which talks about that. So if you're interested to know more about the limitation of ABAC, we would encourage you to look at that set of literature in detail, but we won't talk about that too much here. But that's one of the limitations and one of the reasons why we see move towards ABAC. And of course, as we told you before, the decoupling of app logic from the security or business logic, and to kind of how to do that in a very nice and clean way. And the maintenance overhead, because if you do access control in if then else statements, the moment you have changes in your logic, you're going to have to go back into the code, change the code, go through the whole verification process before a dev code can go into production, and go through the whole cycle. So the maintenance overhead over there, and the complexity of authorization policies. Because if you look at the last couple of years and think about all the compliance regulatory needs that has kind of cropped up in the last couple of years, it's humongous. And a lot of the simpler policy modeling or the simpler policy languages just can't cope up with that. And multitude of channels and access scenarios are also making it not so easy to do access control, because now you have tablets, you have VPN-based users, we have cloud-based users who can log in, and what access control do you need for them will change based on the risk scores and things like that. And of course, you also need a policy-driven centralized access control. Right. So are these kind of the drivers you also see, you also see when you talk to customers from your side?
Yes, absolutely. And I think very many Spring developers will recognize this as well. When they started working with Spring, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, an application was typically something that had one indicated input place, sort of an interface where users would interact with the application. And it probably would have a back end, at least a database or somewhere else to store the data, right? But it's a fairly easy way to draw. We have input here and we have sort of output into the database in the back end, right? Today, that application probably has added, any number of new APIs, because it's not sufficient anymore. People don't sit in their offices and come via the desktop computer any longer into the system. They take their mobiles and go anywhere and work from any time. They have tablets and what have you, all these things that you mentioned. And this multitude of APIs towards the same data source simply cannot be covered with roles. I mean, it's quite obvious. If we created the role that gives me permission to do A, B, and C, do I still have those permissions if I come via my tablet from the other side of the globe from a different time zone? Probably not. But it's still me. The identity is the same, right? So do I, this identity, all of a sudden do we need to add a new role for every new channel, for every new time zone, or what have you? It totally explodes in our faces. And that's where we see this drive towards a more fine-grained, but also the policy-driven side, right?
Yep. Indeed. And so if you look at what ABAC is, it's logically it's very simple. So what we have done from an ABAC side of things, or what the move towards is, instead of you using roles, assigning users to roles, you basically describe your policies as concept related to attributes or properties of users or resources. You basically say something like, if a person can edit this, it's more near towards what you would write in English, because if you have a policy says that somebody can approve a transaction if he is the manager, what you would write in your policy basically saying is that if your action is approve and your resource is transaction order, allow it or permit if you are a manager. So it's as simple as that. You write your policies based on attributes, because the role manager, the approved transaction action ID, or the resource called transactions, those are just attributes about various entities in the system. So you write your policies, ask your questions, and get answers related to them as a set of attributes that's available within the system. And from an architectural point of view, this ties in very cleanly with how Spring does things as well, because typically what you would see here is that the user, or a system on behalf of the user, tries to do certain actions on an application or data, and you have an interception layer there that calls out to an externalized authorization service, which evaluates policies. In this case, the question is, can a user access record number 22? And then you have an evaluation happening at the service which says, okay, do allow that access if certain conditions are met. And then you can decide based on those attributes that's given, or even attributes which are looked up externally, for example, from an LDAP directory or a SQL server, or even from the cloud, because you would have some information in salesforce.com and things like that, and you make your decisions to allow or not allow a specific action. And if you look at it how Spring and Spring applications work, you would see that Spring security is perfectly positioned to be at that interception level, because it sits like a wrapper around your application. If you look at the decoupling nature between app logic and the security logic, and there you can call out to these external what we call the policy decision points, the PDPs, or the evaluations authorization services, to make decisions on behalf of the application security logic. And if you look at the any depth architecture that we so like to point out, is that it again ties very nicely with Spring, because Spring security works, as we mentioned before, at the presentation tier, the web app tier, or even the business tier. So you kind of get a point of interception on all the different tiers that you would be interested in. You can call out to the same authorization service, which might have the same set of policies all across the enterprise, and get decisions. So you basically, with one single framework, can call out to the one single authorization service, which have multitude of policies, which can be as complicated as you want, to make decisions, which is much, much more than what you would do if you did that within your application. And
straight. When we look at this picture, I think it's apparent as well when we see it this way. We compare that to the picture that you have had out of the Spring documentation from early on, with the Access Decision Manager, how well aligned the two are. So to a certain extent, we could consider the traffic light here, the policy enforcement points, right, and the policy server. They correspond logically very well to sort of the notion of externalizing things to an Access Decision Manager within Spring, right? So it's extremely well aligned, the whole thing, and the ideas have already been there. What is being added here a lot is a standard for it and a policy language, right?
Indeed, and basically extensions to the Spring framework to allow you to use them in a way.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Mm-hmm.
So if you look at what we have been doing in the last couple of months from Axiomatic side of things is being trying to extend the Spring security capabilities so that we can hook on to these externalized authorization services that we as vendors work with as well. So let's take a look at what we have done. As we have seen, Spring Security has almost everything in place, especially when it comes to the expression language, because it makes annotation easy, it makes interception easy, and furthermore, it makes extension easy. And what we have done in our work is basically use exactly the hooks that Spring Security gives you, the intercept URLs, the annotations, and the tag libraries, and use them and just do extensions on them. So let's take one by one the three different interception layers we looked at before. The first is the URL level access control, so the web expressions, where you used to have expressions called has role, and then you would be able to provide the role that you want to check against. Now you could basically use a new method or a new expression, the lingo that's used in Spring Security called XACML decision URL. And that implementation within our SDK will call out to the PDP, the policy decision point, and ask for a yes or no decision from the evaluation service. And based on the permit or the deny you get, you basically don't allow access and throw an exception if it's a deny, or you give access to that specific URL request. And you can see that you can actually provide all the attributes that you want to send off to the PDP as parameters to this method call. So if you have the user information available at that point, you can slot it in there. If you have other information related to the access, for example, the method type and so on, you can slot it in there, and that will all get sent off to the PDP. So as you can see, we still use the intercepted URL concept. What we do basically is to add an extension to the expression that's available. So we hook on to the flexibility of Spring Security, so there's no real overhead from a class loading and the class initialization point of view, or from the internal class capabilities. It's just an external function that we call out to. And similarly for the JSP UI level, where we used to use the SIG authorize and have things like authenticated checks, what we do here is basically call another method. In this case, we just call it XACML decision UI. And again, you can pass in attributes at that point as well. So you could basically do exactly what you used to do for URL at the UI level as well, and pass in attributes. And the XACML decision UI method that we have implemented basically calls out to the PDP, provides it with all the attributes it needs for the evaluation, and gets back a permit deny. And if it's a deny, you don't show the link in this case, or if it's a permit, you show the link in this case. So here what you see is that you can actually provide all the information that you have that you think will be useful for evaluating, and then let the evaluation engine do the heavy lifting of accessing the policies, evaluating the policies, calling out to the external world to find out more information if needed, and get you back a simple yes or no. So you pass off the heavy duty lifting to an external source who does it for you and sends it back. The same kind of capability would exist for the method and access control, method level access control as well. So we still use the pre-authorized, the post-authorized, the pre-filter, and the post-filter, except that we, instead of using the inbuilt expressions that's available from Spring Security, we have defined our own extensions, the XACML decision pre-post, the filter pre, and the filter post. Again, the attributes you can specify as part of the method call parameters. So as you can see, what we have done actually is hook on to the capabilities of Spring and extend it so that we can do our own access control logic. And here, the extension of that access control logic is to call out to the PDP and make decisions and get the informed decision and then evaluate it based on that. So from a SDK point of view, what we have been doing in the last couple of months is to come up with an SDK that helps integrate customers' Spring application with XACML, the Extensible Access Control Markup Language. It's a form of ABAC system that's widely adopted. It's a standard-based ABAC system, which we are one of the foremost vendors of, and use that the policy decision point capability or the authorization service for the access control. We provide URL, UI, and method level authorization capabilities using the kind of methods that we saw before, and hooking on to the Spring Security's inbuilt interception points. We also realized early on in our work that people or the app developers have very specific and very varied degrees of extensibility they require from an SDK like ours. So we provide a lot of overloaded methods that you can use it in a lot of different contexts. And we also provide a pattern of giving an implementation which is more of an interface level implementation for some of the classes that then can be implemented at the developer side to pass information that you think is more appropriate. So let's give an example. Let's say that you, when you're writing an application, and realize that whatever be the access control you are asking for, wherever you are asking for, you almost always want to pass in the user information. Now, one way to do that, as we mentioned before, a user, let's say user ID or username. One way to do that, as we saw before, is to pass it as a part of the attribute that you give as a part of the parameter call to the method, the parameters as part of the methods. But that can get tedious because you don't want to write username, user.id every time you want to do a call out. So what you could do as a part of our SDK implementation is write your own method, or rather do your own implementation of an abstract method where you say that these set of attributes are always added on to your PDP request whenever you call out to the PDP. And there you could put in one of the attribute as user ID. So things get simpler and more cohesive if you start using those implementations. And what we have done is minimal XACML based configuration. So if you have a Spring Security application and you want to extend it to use our capabilities that we have added on, you need to modify some XACML configurations and you'll be ready to go. And from the fact that we do use our native Java SDK in this work, you get a lot of nice features as well from it, one of them being the connection pooling capability, which makes it easier for you to decrease the overhead of all these connections. So if you're interested, you can call or contact Kelly Shelton at axiomatic.com, or if you're already a customer of ours, please feel free to contact your account manager for more information regarding the Spring Security SDK. But that's not all. In addition to the capabilities that we have mentioned, a couple of these capabilities come, some of the two more capabilities come for free as well if you start using the Spring Security SDK. One is the use of annotations to annotate your XACML attributes. Let's say that you are writing your application code and you realize that there is a variable, in this case called location, that always contains the location of a user. So you just want to say that, okay, when the application runs and when you call out to the PDP, just use the value in that field and give it off to the PDP as a subject attribute. Now, the way you can do that easily using AOP by basically using an annotation we have introduced called the XACML subject attribute, and there will be other attributes that we can support, for example, resource attribute and so on. So basically what you're saying is that this string location will always be considered a subject attribute, and the value of that attribute will be the value of that field whenever you call out to the PDP. So you basically can make it easier for yourself to pass off attributes to the PDP by annotating it within your code. And we'll be more than happy to explain that in detail if you're interested to know more further information and details about it. But for efficiency, of course, you can specify classes that are annotated, so you don't have to go through scan through all the classes, or you could provide a shorter list of fields that you want to pass off to the PDP when you're calling a specific access control request. So all that comes for free in a way if you start using the SDK that we provide. The other thing that we have seen customers ask about is, look, it's fine and good if you say that we can pass attributes to the PDP. So we pack in all the attributes that you can think of, let's say 100 of them for every time you call the PDP, because we don't know what the PDP might want. So isn't that an overkill? Wouldn't you actually need to have only 5 of those 100 actually when you're evaluating the policies? That's right, because some of the policies can be complex, some of them can be simple, and you might need only very small number of attributes. So out of the 100, maybe only 5 of them are useful. So if you just blast off 100 attributes to the PDP, it might be an overhead. So what we have identified is a pattern where if you have a set of attributes that you know are core attributes, that's the minimal set of key attributes. For example, the user ID is an example of it, because you can look up a lot of things from the user ID, but user ID is hard to look up from something else. So we call them key attributes. Then you pass them off to the PDP, and if the PDP needs more information, say for example the location of the user, it can actually call back into the Spring application. So the Spring application becomes the source of attributes as well, and you can use that as a PIP, which we saw in the architecture before, the policy information point. So basically you identify a minimal set of attributes, and the rest you can actually hook back into the Spring applications to get back more information as well. There are different patterns of doing that. One of them is to basically provide REST interfaces to query these values. So you could basically say, I have a user ID X. Can you find out all the information about that user? So for example, location, the role that the user has in that application, things role underscore admin, role underscore user, and so on. Those can be queried as a kind of logical part of the framework. These things, of course, will be app specific, but the concept has been shown to work in a couple of production systems, and we are relatively sure of them being able to applicable to any specific application as well.
Certainly, a question here. You know, when we talk about the Spring environment serving both as a pip and a PEP, in your example, it was the same environment, sort of the same Spring application serving both as a client in relation to the authorization service and a service provider to it, a server. But it could be different services as well, right? Just as well.
Oh, yes.
So if I have one Spring application is a workflow application, and another Spring service that I've implemented does storage of records, and then within I'm trying to get to record, and the policy states that okay, you can get to this record provided that the record is shown in stage 4 of the workflow. Then I'd need to find out which related workflow is this record related to, and in which stage is that workflow. So I would need to go and ask the other application, right? And that
Yes.
could work as well, right?
Yes, indeed, of course, yes. You're right about that, Finn. You can basically use 2 different Spring applications. One is being the enforcement point, which calls out to the PDP, and PDP can then query a different Spring application and get more information about the user. Indeed, that pattern definitely exists.
And this sort of falls in neatly as well with the drive that we see towards more tighter and smaller APIs, collaborating, yep. Smaller services, right? Yep. Working together.
It's always been the Unix mantra: do one thing well and do it. Do one thing and do it well, kind of thing. So, yeah, exactly. So it ties in very well with that as well, indeed. So, in conclusion, what we have tried to convey is the fact that Spring Security, the way it's designed, the way it's implemented, is in a perfect position to be extended to use fine-grained policy-driven externalized authorization framework, like the Extensible Access Control Markup Language. And what we have shown is the approach towards doing that using extensions to the expression language that they propose. And our SDK allows you to take advantage of the code that we have written to call out to the policy decision point, use the goodies that we provide along with it, for example, annotations and PIP capabilities and so on, to make your Spring applications much more secure from a very fine-grained point of view. So those were the key points we wanted to give to you in the webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them as a part of the GoToMeeting window, and we'll be happy to take that the next few minutes.
Yes, and Sridhar, you have to be careful there because we already have a lot of questions. So before we go into those, a word of warning. I think we may have more questions than we can answer within the hour. We only have 8 minutes left. I propose we proceed and answer all the questions. For those of you who can stay with us, we're happy to have you, of course, and we absolutely understand that we may exceed your time limits because we'll reach the full hour before we're done, I'm sure. But let's go. We have very interesting questions here, Sridhar.
Yep, good.
So, and we'll start with the first one that's related to what we talked about now at the very end. If you think of an application as a microservice-based one, do you think authentication and authorization should be built as independent services running on two independent Spring containers?
Yep, you could do that. I mean, I'm not the best guide when it comes to microservices because I've used it on and off here and there. I've written a couple of services, but from a logical kind of design point of view, you could do that. But the point, of course, is to make sure that they get coupled without any security lapses in between, because you don't want to lose information that's context specific when you talk about authentication and then move over to authorization. But as a service, you can definitely do that, indeed.
Right. And in the end, very often, wouldn't you agree that what we see within identity and access management at large is that these services need to relate very well sort of to the performance requirements that you have. You typically very often in applications will have peak hours, for instance.
Yep.
The one reason to separate may be, of course, performance reasons. But if you do not have those, there's not necessarily much value in doing so, as long as you know that you have sufficient load balancing or what have you to meet high availability requirements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then the good thing is we have one question that already has been answered by the person who asked the question. But we'll take that one. Doesn't the expression language also come with some kind of voter implementation for authorization, where it uses the permission evaluation inside the voter? Spring documentation has been pretty bleak.
So,
and then you came to. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, because I think the next point in the slide itself explained that, because the web expression, security web expression has what's called the web expression voter, and each one of them actually internally gets implemented as a voter. It's just that when you write your access control rules, you don't have to worry about writing your own voters because they come basically what Spring Security did in 3.0 was to write voters and expose a user-friendly interface to it in a way.
Yeah. Okay, right. We have another challenging question here that sort of is interesting in relation to how we should see ABAC versus RBAC, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, one of our attendees says, but doesn't Spring already have a has permission, an addendum to the has role that would support ABAC over and above RBAC?
Well, yes. I mean, the way to do that, I mean, has permissions, as you rightly pointed out, is much more than what has role does. And I mean, maybe it's my kind of fault to say kind of equate the role as RBAC and kind of give the notion that permission would be much more, because permission allows you to do a lot more checks. For example, has IP address is more than role. So definitely Spring already has capabilities which is above and beyond role based. What we are seeing though is that still almost every implementation that comes out of the box looks at access control rules which is localized. There's no implementation that goes out to an externalized sources that can kind of use the power of XACML as we have seen and used within our context. And I mean, what we are doing here is not really rocket science, because at the end of it, what we are doing is what Spring allowed us to do by extending the Spring expression language. What we are doing is basically building on top of our native Java PEP SDK that we provide to our customers and doing one layer on top of it specifically for Spring users, so they don't have to write or extend as permissions in this case, or write your own class and then methods to do the call out to the PDP.
Right, but Sridhar, wouldn't you agree as well that one of the big, if we were to ask ourselves, why, when, and how should I bother to go beyond what Spring already has to go ABAC? Wouldn't it be true then to say that one good test case is to ask to what extent do you need the dynamic policy-based approach of ABAC? Like, for instance, even if we could ask any fine-grained question about a specific static property that a user has or an object has, the strength I see with ABAC is that it combines this in the policy that we, for instance, could have a policy that states, all right, you are allowed to approve this transaction, provided you were not the person who created the transaction, base record in the first place.
Yep.
That sort of dynamic thing that allow us to express the business logic of governance in a meta language, right? That is something that we'll never be able to capture in a simplistic sort of, does the user have this permission or this, because that is static as opposed to dynamic evaluation of a policy, right?
Yeah, indeed, definitely. I mean, there is definitely, I guess, the need, and I think it's a market, and our external world has seen the need for the policy-based access control, because there, as you rightly pointed out, you can write policies based on relationships, and those relationships can exist beyond that specific instance, because you basically can look at the history of some event happening and decide based on that. In this case, as you said, allow something to happen only if he did not do some other action beforehand. So state-based stuff, basically. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, and that leads us to the next question, that sort of which we could see as a follow-up. Basically, anyone could implement a permission evaluation engine that does ABAC and get it driven from Web Expression Voter, or maybe another custom voter, right?
Oh yes, definitely. But what we are saying is that we have done that heavy duty lifting. So if you're interested, you can just use the SDK and not have to write your own implementation, rather than start understanding how Spring does some of the things internally. But yeah, of course, it's what we did. So somebody else can definitely do that.
Yes, and you didn't mention too much about XACML in the presentation.
I'm sorry, I think we have lost you, Finn. It became a bit choppy.
Oh, sorry. Hope this is better. You mentioned.
I can't get out of Finn, so maybe I will take one more question, and then maybe I can. Hopefully, the Andre and Finn comes back by that time. I have one question which says, do you have a replay of the webinars? We do have the replay of the webinar, so we will upload these things once recorded, and we'll provide, I think, all the attendees with the URL of the replay as well as slides, so you can actually go through the slides as well. Maybe one last question. Finn and Andre, are you guys there? So I can take one more last question.
Yes, we're still here. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Oh, very good. Okay.
So there was this question which says, do you support Spring Boot? Our ABAC SDK does not work, or we haven't really worked with Spring Boot yet, but it does not prevent us from doing it quickly because, as you may have guessed by now, we have what's called what we internally call the Java PEP SDK, which is framework agnostic, which can be used for almost every kind of situations. And what we do for the Spring SDK is built on top of that. So if there are hooks like what Spring Security provides, it would not be too much of work to use the internal capability of our native Java PEP SDK to write an SDK wrapper around that Spring Boot can work with. So that's definitely doable. It's not something that we have seen a lot of our customers ask for, so we haven't invested the resources on it yet.
Right, but basically there will hardly be a need to go beyond the generic Java PEP SDK, will there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you have the hooks in place, you should be able to call into the Java SDK and write the wrapper as you would do in the case of the Spring SDK.
So Sridit, next question. Once an authorization is successful, do you keep the policies evaluated inside the authentication object as a granted authority or something?
We right now don't, because we saw a couple of loopholes in there and a couple of app-specific requirements about it. So we have not been able to generalize it enough to be able to do that. But the idea is pretty nice because basically what you're saying is that for every authorization and every set of authorization, you basically associate it with a role or an authorization granted entity, and then basically cache that and use that cached information for further access control. Logically, it's doable, and we can implement it without too much effort as well, but the implementation might be application specific, so we haven't absorbed that into the SDK yet.
But that said, though, the caching mechanism of the policy of the authorization service would serve basically similar needs, although there would be an outreach, of course, to query, but the query would respond faster then, right?
Yes, yes, we do have caching at the evaluation engine side.
Yeah. So, and the next question is related. Do you cache the authenticated and authorized information in some external database for easy lookup? And that the answer then is no, we do not. But we have caching built into the system as such. Very good. One last question, Sridit, around the use cases again. If you've been mentioning many times that Spring has all these ready hooks, so why would one bother sort of to go outside? What type of use cases motivates going beyond Spring? When is Spring insufficient?
So yeah, I think most of the use cases are driven by the complexity of the policies, because a lot of times the complexity, because we have had customers who work in the defense sector, who works in the financial sector, and who has a lot of regulatory compliance needs when it comes to enforcing. So a lot of these things are very hard to codify in the expression capability that Spring provides, and that has been our primary driver most of the time, because you basically cannot extend, you cannot do the fine-grained access control you want in Spring Security Expression language as it is now. So people look for options, and one of that option is to use XACML, and then you call out. And the other related one is you don't want your access control logic to be scattered across application code as well, which Spring still does. Spring Security still does. You want a centralized policy-based management entity, and that's again where the externalized authorization service neatly fits in the picture, and that's again one of the